Okay, La Guerra di Gradisca. Um, I have to say, this is the kind of obscure situation from a period that I love. It's an operational game. You got to compare it to things like One by the Sword, for example. Now, One by the Sword has multiple scenarios and everything, but I felt like this did a much better job of uh, presenting something that was attractive and fun to play. I felt, and maybe if there were six different scenarios of this, I would get bored of it. But my feeling after one scenario of One by the Sword was kind of that I was bored. With this, I feel like, yeah, I would be into playing more of these. Let's start with the components. Counters, little glossy ones, functional. A little bit of a problem with some of them. Some of the color schemes on them, hard for my eyes to distinguish. It looks very clear on here. Well, no, it doesn't. So, for example, the differentiation between the dark blue and the black, very hard to tell. And likewise here between gray and purple. I found that difficult to determine that there was a differentiation there. Cards, cards are wonderful these days. That's all I have to say. Every game is coming that needs cards is coming with some kind of playing card quality cards. These aren't the most fantastic out there, but they just blow away everything that that you may have seen from that 80s and 90s period where they're using card stock that you have to rip apart and everything. It's just so wonderful that games can come out with custom made cards without it being a ridiculous expense. It was the kind of thing that Risk came with real playing cards for it and everything. But when you needed to do a small run, even in Avalon Hill games and everything, until the 90s, you weren't seeing them. You saw them in Blackbeard, and since then, almost anything. Now you can get from GameCrafter what must be basically print-on-demand cards. I don't know how they even do that with any reasonable level, but did I talk about the map? The map is a work of art, but what I did find was it was difficult to discern the boundaries, especially when you got these yellow triangles in here and you got the X's on the boundaries and everything. It's not terrible that they fade into the background, but that other things kind of jump out at you. For example, river lines that have no meaning in the game that appear darker and more prominent. That was a little bit problematic for me. Quite often I found myself having a hard time seeing the borders between areas that regulate gameplay. I'm not suggesting something more garish. Actually, if anything, those yellow triangles kind of disturb me more than the difficulty in seeing the borders. But it is a factor, and something that you have to think about it from your own perspective, which is going to bug you more. This is just a player aid sheet for setup. Good quality, tells you what you need. There's one scenario, so it's got everything on there. The only difficulty with it is it's two-sided. Two small regular sheets of paper might be better. Of course, you can photocopy it, but it means that's great for solitaire play, but if you're playing against somebody, you kind of both want to have one of these in front of you as you're setting up the game to speed things up. Whatever. The rulebook's glossy. I don't like glossy rulebooks. It's written first in Italian, which take longer and may be more, may go into more detail. And then there's an English translation of them. But I guess the biggest thing that's missing is the introductory stuff is in Italian. This is not. I'm not counting this in that. Hey, the Italian rules are longer. There's also, in addition to that, an introductory section in Italian and designer's notes in Italian, which, you know, a shame that they're not in English as well. I understand the limitations of printing. I understand that they know their audience and whatever. And they did provide those materials, I think, translated in English on their website, I'm told. What about the game? So, it's a period dominated by trying to capture cities and key locations by positioning your forces and besieging them. And this is one which focuses on the capture of one particular walled town, Gradisca. It's not the only thing. It's not like, you know, the Art of Siege games, although it does incorporate some of the same concept, like I'm bombing the wall with my bombards and trying to get a breach through them. Speaking of the rules, there are places where they're inconsistent. There are places in the cards where it's difficult to see them. The fact that the cards are split into both Italian and English gives them less room to be as specific as possible. And again, preference is given to the Italian speaker. It takes up a little bit more space. It's better presented in that part of the card. Eventually, you know, if this were to catch on in America, and they wanted another printing, maybe they could split it into two different language printings or something. But, you know, you can understand this is not, you know, a very popular topic. It's not, it's not your Battle of the Bulge or Gettysburg, right? And again, you know, they know their audience, and I can understand that. It is something, though, that as an English gamer, or an English-speaking gamer, primarily, you do have to kind of understand that that's going to be you're going to be paying a slight burden on it. All right, what about the rules? Well, the game's broken into a basic and an advanced game. And the basic game is fairly simple, maybe lacking some historical, there may be some very ahistorical things you can do in the basic game. Things that are kind of disturbing because it doesn't take supply into account. It really is just a chit pull game where you're using kind of, not really, I don't know. It's kind of a buckets of dice game, but each unit has a different to hit number on it. So it's not, you know, it's kind of like an Axis and Allies type of thing in terms of the combat system. Which immediately, you know, when I read that, and I just ordered something that I think was saying it's basically ancient Axis and Allies and should be arriving soon. You know, I have great trepidation, but honestly, a lot of systems that I like use something like that. There's nothing inherently bad about, you know, a bunch of dice and different quality values to roll against. So it's a simple way of achieving something believable. The only problem with it has to do with frontages and such. And this game actually, you know, it's not that big a deal from my concern. I know some people are really unhappy with buckets of dice. Personally, if you are accounting for frontages and such, not, it makes sense. This game does not, but it also may not be a big deal. The larger army should be able to cause more losses to the smaller army, right? You have a number of different types of units in the game. Basically, you have regular combat units, infantry, cav. Cav is able to move a little faster. In the advanced game, there's more differentiation. You have artillery units, which can do a few things. They can bombard in and out of city during a siege type situation. They can also be used in field combat. You have engineers who are kind of necessary for the placement and proper usage of the artillery. If you don't have them present, your artillery is going to suck. And you have leaders who allow you not only a combat capability, which can greatly enhance a small force actually, because they have basically the same kind of firepower that a unit does, but it can also allow you to coordinate forces in a way that's kind of pleasant to me. The other thing you have to regulate which units you're going to be moving is it's a chit pull game. So you have formations, but they're kind of weird. They may not be all collected at one place at any given time in the game. So what it may indicate is forces that if you did somehow bring them together could be coordinated into a real formation, but otherwise are just kind of these disparate units, and you're only going to be able to activate in one area of those units, at least without a commander. With a commander, you can activate a larger grouping. Now, in the basic game, when you have a commander, I believe you're able, I didn't play the basic game, but I believe you're able to activate anywhere on the board from that command, which feels kind of weird. It doesn't feel like that commander's giving orders or whatever. In the advanced game, he's got a range consideration, which is really an important facet because you do want to keep your commands together. Other chits that represent commands, it may be unreasonable to collect those forces together because there's like a chit that is the command of basically like all your militia. Well, your militia spread out throughout the board, and you're able to activate a couple of them and do something little with them, but you can't do anything major. But if you manage to collect a bunch of them together, you could actually do a massive attack with them that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. It's unlikely you'd be spending much effort on that. It may not be the wisest thing to do, but that's kind of a, well, the players aren't likely to do this, and this is a reasonable solution if they don't do it, and let's not worry about, the chance that they might. Too much, at least. Okay, the game uses these cards, and when you draw a chit, you can activate that command. And when you activate the command, you can play one or two cards in addition to activating the command. If you have mandatory cards in your hand, you must activate that command and play the mandatory card and any additional cards that you have in hand. A single additional card can be used to augment that. If you don't have a mandatory card in hand, you can choose to pass that command's activation and instead draw a new card. And then you may have to discard because you have a hand limit of 4 cards. How does that all work in terms of the play? Well, some of the cards are controlled by the player, i.e. not mandatory, that feel like they shouldn't be. Things like rain or rivers flooding, where you're able to kind of use them to abuse your opponent with something that, I don't know, just doesn't really feel like you should be able to do it in quite that way. This is the same problem I have in CDGs with bad weather. What? It feels kind of like the kind of card mechanism that you see in War of the Ring. In this, you can discard cards and they'll come back and maybe your enemy will get them. What you don't have is that sort of mechanism of you discard it face down and the enemy now can draw your discard, and stuff like that. Instead, they have to wait for the deck to come back out. So you're not playing that same kind of risk level when you're throwing a card out. I don't know. That's just a gameplay type thing for me. I don't really like such gaming mechanisms as exist in War of the Ring, although I do not mind, and I'm talking about the old SPI one here, I do not mind that there because, hey, there's wizards and, godlike creatures in charge of each side. So that doesn't feel unreasonable here, but in that game, in this game, it feels really weird that Venice or Austria have anything at any level which can determine whether or not the rivers are going to flood, or whether or not there's going to be an epidemic. I feel like those cards should be mandatory. Some of the others are a little bit more iffy. So, what about a reinforcements card? Okay, some of those are not mandatory. If you hold it, it makes sense. You get to choose whether or not to call for those reinforcements as the player who's affected by it. If your opponent holds it, is that reasonable? Well, maybe. Maybe they have some diplomatic capabilities that can prevent you from being able to deploy those reinforcements easily. And I'm okay with that kind of level of stuff. It's really when you're starting to get into the acts of God and weather and nature that I'm like, I just don't buy that the Austrian court generals or even down to a private alchemist, anyone had that capability to influence the weather. That doesn't fit my conception of reality. So that becomes kind of problematic. Can you ignore it? Sure. Because there is some interesting gameplay that comes around in terms of holding the cards off to be able to use them to your best advantage. And I know people make arguments somehow as to it's got to do with your preparedness and everything. No, it doesn't. I have a choice of when to land this blow of the river flooding or of an epidemic or whatever. And if I can control that, that seems unreasonable. Okay. What am I talking about here? So when you do activate a unit, there's a number of things you can do. And each unit has different choices. So they can do movement, which might involve combat. And there's some weirdnesses when you get to the supplies where you have to kind of nail things down better. They can bombard the fortress or out of the fortress if you're besieged. You can do mining or counter mining on the fortress, which can be done in conjunction with the bombarding, and the engineer who set up the artillery can apparently do both at the same time. You can build forts, which are very useful. I didn't do this at all in my game. I used my engineers basically for the siege itself. I didn't bother building external forts to help the siege get along. That might be a reasonable thing to do because it helps hold you in place and reduce your losses in that location. And units can, instead of doing any of those other things, recover from a disorganization. The actual movement is, for the most part, well, it's 3 areas for infantry and engineers, 2 areas for artillery. I may have screwed that up. Cav are able to move 5 areas, and for the most part, each area costs you 1 movement point to move into, but those triangles are difficult terrain, mountainous, whatever. They cost you 2, so you can't move very far with most of your units. Cav can get some distance there. The actual combat, like I said, it's kind of a buckets of dice type of thing. In the basic system, you just roll 1 round of combat, and the person who takes the most damage has to retreat. I gotta do something about my battery there. It isn't working. Your first hit generally disorganizes a unit and reduces its effectiveness. This can also happen through other means like flooding and epidemics. And the way you recover it from disorganization is by spending an activation doing nothing with that particular unit. Other units in that command can do other stuff. Bombardment, it uses an art of siege type system where artillery can fire. And they're able to reduce the strength of the walls that they're facing. if they end up destroying the wall, getting a breach in the wall, I don't think that can be repaired. At least that's how I read the rules. But as you reduce the strength of the wall, enemy engineers inside the city can rebuild those walls and repair them. This kind of fits the rules that I took from Art of Siege. So I'm, tainting it with that interpretation where it's like, yeah, that's, if you do have a breach, that's going to be pretty damn hard. You can put some temporary defenses, but you're not going to be able, yeah, there's something wrong with my battery charger happening. You're not going to be able to completely put that wall back up in a way that prevents the enemy from being able to rush through the breach. You've got mining capabilities where you get to tunnel under the wall and maybe blow it up. And these are, like the artillery and repair checks, these are also things where you have to roll a die to see if you succeeded, which I'm fine with. How well does it work? I don't know. I really don't know the accuracy and effectiveness of an engineer at, tunneling and counter tunneling and rebuilding walls and all that. All fits under one value that you make a single roll for any of those activities. That doesn't seem likely, but on the other hand, I don't have any reason to really dispute it. Let's see. Like I said, there's forts. The forts allow you to ignore a hit when you're attacked in any form of combat. And there's also fortified towns, which have the same effect, but are more, are there to begin with, I guess. I don't know. And the goal of the game is to gain victory points. You gain victory points from specific locations, which are noted on the map. And then there are starting locations that have a victory point counter, which is a smaller number of victory points, but an unknown and somewhat random value that you discover when you capture that area. When you capture the areas with the victory point markers, you've grabbed booty, and it's a one-time gain of victory points. For the on-map ones, you have to hold them at the end of the turn, or at the end of the game. Okay. The basic game allows you to move pieces of a command, without too much concern for where the commander is. It allows you to basically consolidate forces and make attacks without regard to supply. Rivers don't have as much of an effect. The advanced rules add a great deal more, I think, realism and detail to the system. So, sometimes you're going to be able to sort of pass through an enemy force, and this works pretty well. Rivers become more of an impediment with this. You are able to pull units outside your direct command with a leader to pull them into battle. You're also able... your commander can only command units that are within 2 areas, not movement points, interesting, of that commander. I thought it was 3 movement points. It works out pretty close to the same. The field combat itself. Okay, so I think I fucked this rule up. I think I did it so that it limits to 2 rounds of combat. The actuality is, if you win a round of combat, I think the rules say that you can just keep fighting as long as you want. So if you get the advantage on the enemy, you will wipe them out. I'm not sure how much I like that. I liked the 2 rounds. It gave you this option of, do I repulse the enemy or do I just keep fighting a pitched battle? Um, but really, really long battles without the enemy being able to disengage at cost. These are not armies that just almost invariably would wipe, a victory would wipe out the enemy army. And I'm not sure that I like how I see this as written at this point. I've been kind of dissecting these advanced rules throughout the game. And I kind of liked what I was playing, which is you can hold them there for a second round and fight a second round of combat, but I don't really know about the idea of holding someone in check and just wiping out their entire army, as long as you keep getting more hits on them. That does not really work for me. Difficult terrain gives you a slight reduction in the enemy's firepower when they're attacking. Forts, it's possible to put more than 1 fort per area in the advanced game. Okay, supplies. Supplies are necessary in order to recover from recover from disorganization, in order to move a force of 3 or more units into an attack or a raid. And the supply is drawn from either your core supply source, and you have to start there, or, okay, so I'm trying to read this because this is all kind of twisted here. Okay. So I think you can draw normal supply, i.e., and again, I misplayed this, normal supply using your line of supply, but you can't draw attack supply that way. Attack supply requires the camp, which means I made a little bit of a fuck up there. Venetians have a special supply marker that they can supply a coastal force with. But yeah, what I was finding with the supply rules was that you didn't really have the capability to adequately defend your main supply source, because you couldn't kind of shell out from it and launch counterattacks that way. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I was considering the possibility of, hey, modify the rules so that you can draw attack supply, which is the thing you get from camps, by tracing back to your main supply source as though it were a camp, which means you can only trace 3 movement points back to the camp. If I was playing that correctly, who knows? But yeah, that I'm not sure that I feel that that's really necessary, especially since you can trace just back to the camp for normal supply, which means you can recover units. What they did, and there's certain special cases, Gradisca, for example, that is always in supply. Fortresses are essentially always in supply, and Gradisca is a fortress, so I don't know why they split that out. But they did create this concept of marking units with out-of-supply markers. Well, the only time that you ever need supply is right after you've checked supply. So I don't think those markers make sense. And we'll talk about why you might want to use those markers for something else. And this is the option, this is the modification that I most strongly suggest. Okay. In order to get attack supply so that you can move more than 2 units into either an attack or a raid, then you have to be able to trace no more than 3 areas. And now here they talk about Difficult terrain count as 2 areas, so it should really be movement points, but whatever. Because elsewhere they did something similar with the commanders, and I don't know if they said that 2 movement point thing, but that kind of wording choice is just going to create confusion in someone like my head. Back to the camp. And then from the camp, you trace all the way back to your main supply source. Well, what does that mean? I'm trying to think of what I was going to say about this. I know that I had something in mind about this. Yeah, I don't know. And then they jump over to Army morale, which is something different. And basically, if your morale gets low, you're not going to be able to coordinate your forces as much. You may not even be allowed to attack, if I recall correctly. Let's see. When it's low, no unit can receive attack supply. Each command can activate units in a single area. You can never enter in any area with enemy units. You can never play more than 1 card per activation. You want to keep your morale at the highest. It won't affect you then, but there are cards that will lower your morale when they're used, and they're mainly disasters and such not. But also, if you're failing to keep your camp in supply, you may suffer morale losses. You also suffer morale losses every few months. On the turn and record track, every 3 months or every 6 months, you end up getting a morale loss. The war is going on too long, your forces are getting tired, you're going to have to do something. Now, sometimes that do something is there's just mandatory cards that are going to give you a boost in morale as long as you have your camp in supply. The other thing you can do is raids. Raids appear to have 2 purposes in the game. One is to raise army morale, and the second is supposedly to supply units. The problem is your units have to check supply. So your units make their raid. They're no longer out of supply, but the next time they get activated, they have to check supply before they can do anything. And the most important place where you want to do something is that you want to be able to activate combat, a combat action. One of my suggestions is to use the out of supply markers as in supply markers. If you succeed in a raid, you now have combat supply with those units. That may be too much capability. Maybe the intention is that you should not have combat supply. But it doesn't really matter because you check supply when you activate your units. So you have, as soon as the raid is done, you've done something with the raid. Those units are now in supply or something in some way. Anyway, there's something really wrong with the way the raid rules are worked. The way they're written, they have no effect on supply as far as I can see. They don't allow you to recover. They don't allow you to do attacks, etc. And the modifications I suggest should work for that. I also had thoughts about the camp being able to move when it's not with units. I've kind of withdrawn from that. I think that not leaving a guard with your camp is just a bad idea. And you shouldn't have that. Additional special rules, light cavalry are able to do a special kind of attack where they just ride in, shoot, can't be hurt. This is a harassment technique. They tend to have low combat strength, so they're not going to do a lot of damage. They might disorganize a couple units. They might wipe out a lone unit, and then they leave. If they stick around, though, they're stuck in a normal combat, and they're not able to do this. Whoops. Forgot about light cavalry raids. They automatically get disorganized here. There's also a thing that I had difficulty with in playing, even when I was aware of it, which is there's mandatory cards which have a date for when a reinforcement arrives. And these specific cards have an R on them. They're the ones with an R. That might help me remember this. But those specific cards in the advanced game trigger sort of a countdown to the reinforcements. If you, you're not allowed to discard them. And let's see, if you do play them before their time, the reinforcements come on the timeline, and kind of there's a chance that they will come in every turn from now on. I actually like the basic rules better for it, and might just discard that rule like I did unintentionally. Overall, what did it do? Well, the game gave this very static feel. You know, quite a bit of the time you were handcuffed. You couldn't do much. Would that matter much to me? Well, no. I like games like, I like that static feel in games like, I'm trying to think, the Rand Corporation's Great War. I don't mind that at all. I do feel a little bit, it feels too restrictive to me. I feel like I'm missing something when you're drawing the chip pull, and this is, or you're playing a card for activation or something in a CDG, where you can't do anything, where you're looking at these options and you've got one, you're able to do one thing, you're looking at your hand of cards or your chip pull or whatever in this case, and you're just like, yeah, I don't want to do anything. I don't know why that is. Okay, well that sucks pretty bad. My video did not, I didn't hear that my battery cut off, and I don't know where the hell I was. I'm hoping I'm towards the end of, you know, looking at the game itself. I had a whole lot to say that I really liked. And well, let me come back and see where I was, because I just rattled on for a long time without anything happening, without me knowing it was dead. This is because of my damn battery charger, which sits here and it looks like it's working fine and everything, turns green, and I think, you know, it's completely charged. Obviously it's plugged in, but something when the plug isn't right, when it's not sitting correctly in the plug, causes an issue, and it just doesn't end up charging the battery and decides it's all good. So overall, it looks like I got most of what I wanted to say done. I did want to talk a little bit more than I did, and yeah, I know I was cut off in mid-sentence. The static nature, I think, is historically accurate. I think the advanced game, maybe with some modifications, makes sense. And now my battery thing is obviously not charging because it was completely dead. And was doing that again, saying it's just fine. Which is why my battery ran out without me knowing. Plus, this camera eats juice. I think that static nature is absolutely what is desirable for this time period. That handcuffing is absolutely desirable. You shouldn't be doing World War II type coordinated operations with your units, and that works very, very well. The way the combination of these features, that none of them are particularly innovative in and of themselves, but I don't think I've seen a game that puts all these design features together in quite this way, and it works pretty damn well. You might want to be considering those advanced roles. Think about them a little bit more, especially the attack supply, the way the raids work. I went in way too much detail about this again and again, but yeah, I really feel like something's trying to be expressed the way the rules are written, and the actuality of how they're written doesn't do what was intended. And do you want what was intended? And can you guess at what it was? You know, in some way or another, a raid has to say on your next activation you have some kind of special supply consideration. Does it mean you can recover Is that the only thing it means? Does it give you attack supply? I don't know which is intended, but my tendency is to say give it the full attack supply for that whole command in that area with regard to if a raid was successful. Because that allows a couple of units to go by, succeed in getting a raid, and succeed in getting the materials that they need to launch an attack. You know, it also is, you know, no matter what, still more limiting than the basic game. The basic game I don't think is terribly historically accurate. I don't think it's bad. It might be a good option for somebody who wants to have fun in something, you know, that's flavored this way. But in terms of like getting a real historical feel for how the units move, I don't think it does as good a job. I know that I went into the concept of, and this is something where the chit pill really works well, of two units next to each other and you want to swap them. And the chit pill says you take some risk in doing that in a way that an I go, you go game doesn't do. And I think that's very appropriate here. There may be periods of time where you should be able to just seamlessly coordinate that kind of movement. But I think that's one of the best things that chit pill does, is it introduces at least some uncertainty into that. And when you have the possibility, as you do in this game, of at least for the Venetians, them being able to get a double activation with one unit, or a failure to activate a unit, it introduces that uncertainty at all times. Sort of. You might know the card, where that card is that causes that effect. And I guess the big thing for me is obscure subject matter that I'm very, very interested in, and that brought up the other thing that I wanted to say that I know I did. Well, let's see if I'm still recording. The other thing that came up when I was recording was, you know, I went through a list of the Europa Simulations games, and when I did the intro, and I left probably the one that I like the most out, which is All Is Left, Save Honor. And I got to be careful there because of nothing gained but glory, which is a somewhat later period. That one is, and again, it's because of the period as much as the execution and the fun value. But that one is also in northern Italy, and during the French wars in the Renaissance period, a little before this, which is just, you know, really an exciting period for me, where you still have some of the medieval functionality in the military units. And you have the very beginning of this sort of early modern military beginning to show up, where gunpowder units are, you know, you have your musket and pike units just beginning to show up. And it's such a beautiful period. And again, that's an operational game. Oh, one thing I wanted to compare this to that I failed to do in the first attempt at this, Won by the Sword, which I found, you know, I had such high hopes for it, an operational game in 30 Years' War. I think this does a so much better job of, and it may be because of the more limited area, you know, and more limited scope of the campaign, but this seems to do a much, much better job of really kind of detailing what's going on. It also doesn't have a stupid little bubble map. I'm not a fan of bubble maps, so you know, you got that. Areas work a lot better for me. But yeah, this is, I think this is an impressive game. It's one that I would like to play again if I ever have time. And, you know, if I had someone of the nature where, you know, like I had hoped for with my last wife, like I had with my first wife, where, you know, we can sit down and just play a war game, you know, just go through the whole catalog basically without worrying about, hey, is this one of the better games? Or is this going to be evenly matched? Anything like that. And I feel like, my past wife was fine with that. It's just she wasn't that into doing the games when it turned out with it. It was like we just never had time. You know, she withdrew more and more from me. But yeah, let's not go here. Let's stick to the game. Yeah, this is one that I I really like obscure topics, and this is a pretty obscure topic, at least in terms of general interest, and it seems to be um, a functional system within it. I think you have to take a little bit of care. The rules may not be as well presented as you might like, especially when you get to the advanced rules, and they may not have undergone quite the level of development work that the basic game did. Which is a shame because, again, the basic game doesn't provide the same level of accuracy and historical believability that the advanced game does. On the other hand, it might be kind of a cool thing because you can kind of feel like you can tinker with it and make it do what you want, which is always a good thing. All right, I'm going to send this up now. It's a shame, like I'm saying. So far, I've been really impressed with the company, and I may actually end up taking a look at one of their World War One designs. I know they've done a couple of them that I've been vaguely interested in, but I've kind of stayed away from non-grand strategic World War One. But maybe this, I just picked one up recently, the Serbian one from GMT. So maybe I'm gonna get in the mood for a more operational level of World War One stuff. I can't imagine myself being too interested in tactical World War One trench warfare. Although I have something and have played something, but I just don't think that's too exciting. Any more than I think tactical World War II is interesting. I mean, you no longer have formations and stuff, so who cares? All right, let's send it up.